All right, hello everybody. Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the next chapter in our introduction unit. And this chapter is chapter 7 on the reproductive process. And when most people think of the reproductive process, they think of this, right? Sperm and egg meet. They produce an embryo, and then that embryo develops into a young. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. We're going to go over the details here today. So there are two main types of reproduction. There is asexual and sexual reproduction. Um, Asexual reproduction is when there's one parent. There are no reproductive organs. That one parent just makes a copy of itself. Um, those are things like binary fission, where here's a paramecium and it just splits into two, almost like mitosis. Or budding, which you see in this hydra. Hydra is related to a jellyfish. Um, what they do is they grow basically little copies of themselves off the side, see here and here. And when those copies get big enough, they plop off and become their own organism. Another example of asexual reproduction is what we see here in fragmentation. Fragmentation is what happens when a species can break itself up into smaller fragments, and each one of those fragments becomes a whole organism. Right, so we have this is a planaria, which is a type of flatworm. The planaria, if it gets cut in half, let's say the head gets cut off and the tail gets cut off, the head will grow a new tail, and the tail will grow a new head, and it'll be able to um, reproduce like that. And each half is an identical copy of the other half. That's different than sexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, there are two parents. Each parent has a different type of gamete. The gametes fuse. There are sex organs involved in this process. Take you through the three basic types. The first type is bisexual reproduction, like we would see in these mice. There's a male, he releases sperm. There's a female who has an egg internally. Sperm meets the egg, they form a zygote, and eventually that zygote grows into a full-born young. That's different than hermaphroditism. Hermaphroditism is where both organisms have both sets of sex organs, so a male and a female sex organ. And instead of self-fertilizing, like taking their own sperm and fertilizing their egg, what they do is they both fertilize each other at the same time. And that's what the earthworm is doing here. They're passing sperm to each other, and they're receiving sperm from the other worm, and they're both going to be pregnant at the same time. And then the final type is called parthenogenesis. When I first describe it, it might sound a little bit like asexual reproduction, but I'll explain why it's not at the end. So parthenogenesis is where an unfertilized egg can develop into a full-grown organism. So we see the example down here, right? So an egg basically develops into a full-grown organism. That's what happens in Komodo dragons. And if you watched the video yesterday, you could have saw that. But why it's not asexual reproduction is twofold. One, it involves reproductive organs, while asexual reproduction does not. But also, parthenogenesis, the female also has the option of fertilizing her egg. And if she fertilizes her eggs, the young will end up with one sex. And if she doesn't fertilize the egg, they'll end up with a separate sex. It changes depending on the type of animal. There are things like bees, certain insects, Komodo dragons that do this. But in general, let's example, the unfertilized egg can turn into a female, while if it's fertilized, it can turn into a male. That's parthenogenesis. Next on our list is we will be comparing the two different types of reproduction, so sexual versus asexual. Right? What's the benefits and what are the disadvantages? Hopefully you filled out the chart, but if not, here we go. All right, so the benefits of sexual reproduction are that it increases the diversity of the organism, which increases their survival rate, right? The whole point of sexual reproduction is that you're introducing basically two different types of DNA, making this new unseen before combination and giving that offspring genetic diversity. But there's disadvantages to that, right? It takes more energy. Meiosis only allows you to pass on half of your genetic information. It takes more time, more energy input, more resources to find a mate. While asexual reproduction, you don't have to do any of that, right? You can reproduce quickly. Bacteria do asexual reproduction. They're not an animal, but bacteria can go from one bacteria to millions in under 24 hours. right? Because they're just reproducing basically by themselves. They don't have to look for a mate. As long as they have the resources, they can reproduce. So it increases the number of offspring you can make. It increases the convenience. But the downside is that they're all clones and there's no genetic diversity. And if there's no genetic diversity, if they're in a changing ecosystem, it has a harder time of surviving. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the SRY gene. The SRY gene is found on the Y chromosome. It is a gene that's main function is to determine the sex of the growing fetus. So what happens is once the gene is turned on, the um, the body starts to then make certain chemicals that turn the gonads into testicles, and then the testicles will start to secrete testosterone, and that testosterone starts to make the growing embryo, the growing fetus, masculine. So it makes things like a penis or a scrotum or all the little accessory glands inside of a male. Fun fact, this gene is the reason why basically everybody starts out in the womb as a female. And it's the reason why men have nipples, even though they have no function in your body. The body starts out in this base setting of female. And then once the SRY gene kicks in, it stops developing to turn into a female and develops into a male, right? You get the production of testes and a penis and scrotum and all of those other secondary sex characteristics. All right, so now let's look at like the specific parts in sexual reproduction. So specifically, we're going to look at sperm. This is a seminiferous tubule. This is one of the small little tubes that sperm pass through on their way to becoming mature. And this is the process called spermatogenesis. Spermatogenesis is when you make sperm cells. It happens in the testes. Basically, you have this one preliminary sperm cell that goes through meiosis. And if you remember meiosis, you have one cell that divides twice to turn into 4 cells. And each one of those 4 cells is unique. And then after the cells divide, they have to turn into mature sperm cells, right? So they have to get all of their parts. And so the parts of a sperm that they develop, there's the head, which on the top of it contains the acrosome, but also inside of it is the nucleus, where basically all the DNA stored that's going to pass on. Then there's the midpiece. Inside the midpiece, there are mitochondria, which propel the tail. It's what propels the sperm towards the egg, and then the tail is used for movement. And then finally, the acrosome contains enzymes, and the whole function, or the whole point of those enzymes, is to eat away at the membranes that surround the egg. So that's spermatogenesis and parts of a sperm cell. Oogenesis is when you form an ovum or an egg. Instead of forming 4 eggs at one point through cell division, what happens is you just form one large egg and you have these secondary polar bodies. Polar bodies are nothing more than cell membrane and DNA. What happens in this case is that the cells divide unevenly, and they put all of their nutrients and resources and cytoplasm and organelles into this one super large cell, which becomes the ovum, which again is the egg, which can be fertilized. And the whole point of that is to literally put all your eggs in one basket, right? You're putting all of your resources into this one egg in the hopes that that egg is able to be fertilized and can carry on with the development process until the ovum, along with the sperm, implant into the uterus. So there are 3 main types of birthing types: oviparous, oviviviparous, and viviparous. We'll start with oviparous, which is egg birth. This is when eggs are laid outside the body. In this case, fertilization can be internal or external, whether it's before the eggs are laid or after. Some animals abandon their eggs while others provide extensive care. Think of the difference between fish and birds. Right? Fish, once they lay their eggs, they're pretty much gone, while birds have to incubate the eggs for a long period of time to get the young to hatch. But reptiles, birds, amphibian, fish all use oviparous birth. If you watch the videos, the chick development shows you an example of oviparous birth. Next up is oviviviparous. And that is technically called egg live birth, where an egg is still made, but the egg is retained inside of the body of the animal. So the egg and the yolk inside the egg provides all the nourishment and not the mother. In this case, fertilization has to be internal because the egg stays inside the body. This is common in some types of invertebrate groups, along with a lot of aquatic animals, certain fish and reptiles as well. If you watch the video, the shark video or the boa video are both good examples here. Next up is the viviparous birth, and that is basically live birth. This is where the mother provides all of the nutrients and not the egg. So just to compare, right? So the difference between oviviviparous and viviparous is that in viviparous, the mother provides all the nutrients needed for the young to grow inside of her. That means that one, usually the young are a little bit more advanced when they are born, and also it just generally takes a longer time. Think of a human that takes 9 months. Elephants can take up to 18 months. It takes a long time for this process to occur. So a couple words I want to go over, and we're just kind of going through your notes here. So if we talk about the urogenital system, that's a combination of the reproductive system and the excretory system. Um, Certain animals only have like one all-purpose hole called a cloaca. Think of a bird. Um, Most birds only have one hole where everything either comes into or goes out of. So if something's coming out of, we're talking like excretory waste. So that's like urine or digestive waste like feces. Or things can also pass between cloacas. Um, so oftentimes a male will press cloacas with a female and pass his sperm to the female. And that can be used as a reproductive system as well. So that's generally the case, except for if we're talking about females. So most female mammals specifically have separate excretory and reproductive systems. All right. So the main reason for that is basically because you do not want your body waste mixing with the young, right? You don't want the developing young to also be coming in contact with urinary waste and digestive waste. And so those areas of the body um, are separate. Okay, so we can see here, right, the urinary bladder in the female and the uterus, which is the reproductive organ in the female, they don't come out the same hole. In this case, the urine would leave the urethra, while sexual reproduction happens through the vagina. While in a male, everything basically comes out the same system. You can see here the testes, which make the sperm, send the sperm through the vas deferens, and then that sends the sperm from the vas deferens to the urethra, and then it exits the penis through the urethra. Last things we're going to talk about here are reproductive controls, and then a little bit about twins. So in general, hormones control a lot of things that happen in the body. Sometimes it's seasonal releases of hormones. Think of animals that only become like fertile during specific times of the year. Sometimes it has to do with responding to things like temperature or rainfall or social cues. Or it could be year-round cyclic, like we see in humans, where it happens every month cycle. But in general, the hypothalamus, which is a certain part of the brain, controls the release of hormones. In females, we're talking about like estrogen, progesterone, human growth hormone, all of those things control when and how reproduction happens in the body. Final part of today is multiple birth. So many animals can give multiple birth, and that's called multiparous. That's a vocab word that you'll need to know. And that's basically more than one offspring at a time. Armadillos are an example. Armadillos give birth to 4 identical young every time they're pregnant. And there are certain animals that are uniparous, like elephants, where they only give birth to 1 at a time. Elephants, you can think that's pretty obvious, right? The elephants are just generally large. It'd be pretty impossible to fit 2 baby elephants inside of a mother elephant. But also, besides the general size, mothers give great care to their young for a longer period of time when they are uniparous. And finally, identical twins. So identical twins form when there's 1 egg and 1 sperm and they meet, and then early in development, that egg splits off. And 30% of the time, they have separate placentas and amniotic sacs. And in that case, the egg separated in a really early stage. 2/3 of the time, they share a placenta, but they have separate amniotic sacs. And that happens if the splitting occurred after implementation. And then finally, very, very rarely do they share 1 amniotic sac and 1 placenta. And if that happens, it indicates a separation of the zygote occurring after day 9, so really, really late. And this leads to what are known as conjoined or Siamese twins. And in that case, because there's 1 amniotic sac and 1 placenta, basically the embryos are really, really close to each other, and they end up touching at one point, and they develop like that, and that's why they become conjoined. This is different than non-identical twins, also called fraternal twins. Fraternal twins just happen because fraternal twins happen because 1 month, for whatever reason, the female, instead of releasing 1 egg, releases 2. And both of those eggs get fertilized by 2 different sperm, making 2 different embryos, like we see here. So 30% of the time, twins are identical, and 70% of the times, twins are fraternal. So that's all I have for you today.